Hey everyone, tonight we explore what it was like to be a stranger in a medieval town, where showing up without the right connections could literally mean the difference between sleeping in a bed or sleeping with the pigs. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here's the thing about being a stranger in a medieval town. Imagine walking into a place where literally everyone knows everyone else's business, and your very presence sets off alarm bells that you might be a criminal, a spy, or worse, someone who doesn't pay their debts, which, honestly, sounds like a nightmare for anyone who's ever tried to make small talk at a party. Now you might think medieval hospitality was all about welcoming travelers with open arms, but actually, showing up as a stranger meant you were immediately suspicious until proven otherwise. The moment you walked through those town gates, if they even let you through, every single person was sizing you up, wondering what your angle was, and whether you were going to steal their chickens or burn down their houses. Let me paint you a picture of what this was really like. You're approaching a medieval town at dusk, which was already strike one against you, because honest people travelled during daylight hours. The town gates would be closing soon, and the guards were probably already grumpy about having to stay alert for one more traveller. Your feet are sore, your clothes are dusty from the road, and you're carrying whatever meagre possessions you own in a worn leather satchel that's seen better decades. The first challenge was actually getting inside the walls. The gatekeeper wasn't just there to open and close doors. He was basically a one-man immigration office, tax collector, and security screening, all rolled into one perpetually suspicious individual. He'd want to know where you came from, where you were going, what you did for a living, how long you planned to stay, and whether you had any money to pay the entrance tax. Because yes, they charged you just to walk into their town, which somehow makes modern airport fees seem almost reasonable. What's fascinating is that they had this whole system of questions designed to trip up anyone who might be lying. They'd ask about the roads you travelled, what the weather was like 2 towns back, who the local lord was in the place you claimed to come from. Get one detail wrong, and suddenly you're looking at a night in the stocks, or worse. And somehow, people manage to navigate this interrogation every single day without Google Maps or a Wikipedia page about local lords. If you did manage to talk your way inside, congratulations, you just entered what was essentially a giant neighborhood watch program, where everyone was keeping tabs on the new person. Medieval towns were incredibly tight-knit communities where people had lived in the same spot for generations. Your neighbour's great-grandfather probably knew your great-grandfather, and if he didn't, well, that was suspicious right there. The social dynamics were absolutely brutal for outsiders. Every guild, every trade, every decent job was controlled by people who'd known each other since childhood. Want to set up shop as a blacksmith? Too bad, the local smiths had that market sewn up tighter than a knight's armour. Hoping to find work as a baker, the Bakers' Guild would laugh you right out of town, unless you had letters of recommendation from people they trusted, which you obviously didn't, because you were a stranger. So basically, economic survival as an outsider was just Tuesday's impossible challenge for these people. You couldn't just walk into a medieval town and start a business like some kind of entrepreneurial time traveller. Every trade was protected, every good spot was taken, and every opportunity required connections you simply didn't have. This meant that most strangers ended up in what we might charitably call the service industry. Except the service industry in medieval times meant doing the jobs that locals considered beneath them. You might find work mucking out stables, hauling waste, carrying messages, or helping with the back-breaking labour that kept the town running, and even then you'd be paid less than locals and constantly watched for signs that you might steal something and disappear in the night. The housing situation was particularly grim. There were no hotels as we'd recognize them today, just inns that were basically communal sleeping arrangements, where you might share a bed with 3 strangers and wake up with fewer possessions than you went to sleep with. The innkeeper would usually demand payment up front because runners were common, and they'd often require a local person to vouch for you before they'd even consider letting you stay. If you couldn't afford the inn, you might try to negotiate sleeping in someone's barn or stable, which meant spending the night literally with the animals. And somehow, this was often considered a decent arrangement, because at least you had a roof over your head and the body heat of livestock to keep you warm. Medieval people had low expectations for comfort, which probably made them much happier than modern travellers who complain about thread counts. The social customs around meals were another minefield for strangers. Food wasn't just about nutrition, it was about social status, community membership, and trust. Being invited to eat with a family was a significant gesture that meant they decided you weren't going to murder them in their sleep. But most of the time, strangers ate alone, buying whatever scraps they could afford from vendors or cooking over small fires outside the town walls. What's really interesting is how they handled the practical aspects of trust in a world without credit checks or background verification. Medieval communities developed this elaborate system of guarantees and vouching that determined whether you could participate in daily life. Want to buy something on credit? You needed someone local to guarantee the debt. Want to rent a room for more than a night? Someone had to vouch for your character. Want to join any kind of social activity? You needed introductions from people the community trusted. This system meant that having even one connection could transform your entire experience. A single letter of introduction from a respected merchant or clergyman could open doors that would otherwise remain firmly shut. Without it, you were essentially living in a parallel economy where everything cost more, every transaction required immediate payment, and every interaction was coloured by suspicion. The religious aspect added another layer of complexity to being a stranger. Churches were supposed to offer sanctuary and charity, but even religious charity came with strings attached. Priests and monks would quiz you about your faith, your knowledge of prayers, your adherence to church customs. They'd want to know why you were travelling, whether you were fleeing some sin or scandal, and whether you deserved their help. Medieval charity wasn't unconditional. It was conditional on proving you were worthy, which was a tall order when you had no local references. Women faced particularly intense scrutiny as strangers. An unaccompanied woman arriving in town would immediately raise questions about her moral character, her family situation, and her intentions. Was she a widow, a runaway wife, a prostitute, or something worse? The assumption was generally that any woman travelling alone was either desperate or dangerous, and either way, she needed to be watched carefully. Women travellers often had to seek protection from churches or attach themselves to families quickly just to survive the social pressure. The legal system was heavily biased against strangers too. Local courts were staffed by local people, judging disputes involving local people they'd known for years. If you got into any kind of legal trouble as an outsider, you were basically hoping for mercy, because justice was often secondary to community relationships. Steal a chicken as a local person, and you might get a stern talking to and a requirement to make restitution. Steal a chicken as a stranger, and you could find yourself branded, imprisoned, or worse. Even something as simple as getting directions was complicated by your outsider status. People were often reluctant to give detailed information about local geography, trade routes, or important buildings to strangers who might use that knowledge for nefarious purposes. You might get vague directions like follow the road toward the big oak tree, instead of specific information that could help you navigate efficiently. The economic barriers extended to basic services too. Want your clothes mended? The local seamstresses might charge you double what they'd charge a neighbour. Need your horse shod? The blacksmith might push your job to the end of the day. After all, the local customers were taken care of. Require medical attention? The local healer might demand payment up front and provide less thorough care than they would for someone whose family they knew. What's remarkable is how strangers developed their own survival strategies within these hostile systems. Travelling merchants learned to carry letters of credit from major trading houses that were recognised across multiple towns. Craftsmen would seek out other members of their trade guilds who could provide temporary shelter and vouching. Religious pilgrims would carry documentation from churches along their route to prove their legitimate purposes. Some strangers would deliberately attach themselves to local festivals, markets, or religious celebrations where the normal social barriers were temporarily relaxed. During harvest festivals or saints' days, communities were more likely to welcome outsiders who could contribute to the celebration, provide entertainment, or help with the increased workload that came with special events. The seasonal patterns of medieval life also affected how strangers were received. During harvest time, extra hands were always welcome, and temporary workers could find both employment and social acceptance more easily. During winter months, when resources were scarce and communities were focused on survival, strangers were often seen as additional mouths to feed, rather than helpful additions to the community. Language barriers added yet another layer of difficulty for travellers from distant regions. Even within what we might think of as the same country, dialects could vary so dramatically that communication became a real challenge. Strangers might find themselves unable to understand local terms for common items, unable to follow directions, or unable to explain their needs effectively. This communication barrier often reinforced suspicions about their origins and intentions. The clothing and appearance of strangers also conveyed important information that could determine their reception. Dress indicated social class, regional origin, occupation, and wealth level. Someone wearing the wrong style of clothing for their claimed background would immediately arouse suspicion. Similarly, someone dressed too well might be assumed to be a nobleman's spy or a thief with stolen goods, while someone dressed too poorly might be seen as a beggar or potential criminal. Personal hygiene and grooming standards were another way communities identified and judged outsiders. Different regions had different customs around hairstyles, beard trimming, and cleanliness. A stranger whose appearance didn't match local norms would stand out immediately and face additional scrutiny. Even something as simple as having calluses in the wrong places on your hands could betray that you weren't really the type of craftsman you claimed to be. The storage and security of personal belongings was a constant concern for strangers. Without trusted relationships or secure accommodations, travellers had to carry their most valuable possessions with them at all times or risk losing them to theft. This meant that strangers were often easily identified by their bulky travel packs and the way they guarded their belongings, which could make them targets for robbery or reinforce stereotypes about their untrustworthiness. Medieval communities also had informal networks of information sharing that could work against strangers. News travelled surprisingly quickly between towns through merchant networks, religious connections, and family relationships. A stranger who had caused trouble in one town might find their reputation preceding them to the next town, making it even harder to establish themselves in a new community. The process of gradually gaining acceptance in a medieval town was slow and required consistent demonstration of trustworthiness over months or even years. Strangers who stayed long enough might eventually be invited to participate in community work projects, religious ceremonies, or social gatherings. They might slowly build relationships with individual families who would vouch for them in small matters, gradually expanding their circle of trust and acceptance. Some strangers found that specializing in services that locals couldn't or wouldn't provide was a path to grudging acceptance. Traveling doctors, scribes, or craftsmen with rare skills might be welcomed despite their outsider status, because they filled genuine needs in the community. Even then, their acceptance was often conditional on their continued usefulness and good behavior. The psychological toll of constant suspicion and social isolation was significant for medieval strangers. Living in a community where every interaction was colored by distrust, where every mistake was magnified, and where acceptance seemed always just out of reach, must have been emotionally exhausting. Many travelers probably preferred the loneliness of the road to the hostile scrutiny of unfamiliar towns. And somehow, despite all these challenges, people continued to travel, trade, and resettle throughout medieval Europe. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to reach religious sites. Merchants traveled dangerous routes to buy and sell goods. Craftsmen moved between towns, seeking better opportunities. Young people left their birth villages to find spouses or apprenticeships in larger communities. The human drive for mobility and opportunity was strong enough to overcome the social barriers that made being a stranger such a difficult experience. The gradual development of more formal systems for travelers' standardized currencies, recognized trade guilds, established pilgrimage routes, and documented safe conduct passes slowly made life easier for strangers over the centuries. But during the height of the medieval period, being an outsider in a strange town remained one of the most socially challenging experiences a person could face, requiring resilience, adaptability, and a thick skin just to survive the daily interactions that locals took for granted. The daily routine of a stranger began before dawn, when they'd wake in whatever uncomfortable accommodation they'd managed to secure. If they were lucky enough to afford space in an inn, they'd share a straw mattress with several other travelers, trying to sleep despite the snoring, scratching, and general restlessness of people who didn't trust each other enough to sleep deeply. The straw would be crawling with fleas and other insects that seemed particularly attracted to new blood, and the blankets would carry the accumulated odors of countless previous occupants. Morning hygiene was a challenge when you couldn't trust your bunkmates not to rifle through your belongings. Strangers learned to sleep with their money pouches tied to their bodies and their most valuable possessions clutched in their arms. Washing meant finding a well or stream where locals wouldn't object to your presence, which often meant walking outside the town walls to find water that wasn't already claimed by residents for their own use. The search for breakfast revealed another layer of the stranger's dilemma. Bread was the foundation of medieval meals, but bakers often sold their best loaves to regular customers first, leaving strangers with yesterday's bread or inferior grain that locals wouldn't buy. The price was always higher for outsiders too, not officially, but in the way of small surcharges, smaller portions, or less generous measures that added up to a significant penalty for not being part of the community. Finding work for the day required a morning ritual of positioning yourself in the town square or market area where employers might look for temporary labor. But even this was tricky because there were unwritten rules about where strangers could stand, which spots were reserved for local unemployed workers, and how to approach potential employers without overstepping social boundaries. Stand in the wrong place, and you'd get dirty looks from locals who considered it their territory. Approach the wrong person, and you'd be dismissed immediately as someone who didn't understand proper social hierarchies. The types of work available to strangers were limited and often unpleasant. Loading and unloading carts was common, but it required knowing how to properly handle different types of goods without damaging them, and making a mistake could mean not getting paid at all. Cleaning stables meant dealing with animal waste, but it also meant being around valuable horses where any sign of theft or rough handling could lead to serious accusations. Carrying messages required navigating unfamiliar streets while being illiterate in most cases, relying on verbal descriptions and hoping you could find the right destination. The social dynamics of work relationships were particularly complex for strangers. Local workers often resented outsiders who might accept lower wages and undercut their own bargaining power. Employers, meanwhile, saw strangers as disposable labor who could be given the most dangerous or unpleasant tasks without worrying about long-term community relationships. This meant strangers often found themselves doing jobs that locals refused, cleaning privies, handling diseased animals, or working with materials that posed health risks. Payment negotiations required careful navigation of local customs and expectations. Strangers couldn't rely on reputation or future business relationships to ensure fair treatment, so they often had to demand payment immediately upon completion of work. This could be seen as presumptuous or untrusting, but waiting for payment later was risky when you might be gone the next day or when an employer might simply claim the work was unsatisfactory. The midday meal presented another set of challenges. Taverns and food vendors often had informal reservation systems where regular customers got served first and got better portions. Strangers might wait longer for food, receive smaller servings, or find that the best dishes were mysteriously unavailable when they tried to order. The social aspect of eating was also complicated. Locals would eat together, sharing news and gossip, while strangers ate alone unless they were bold enough to try joining conversations where they weren't wanted. Afternoon activities depended heavily on whether a stranger had found work or not. Those with employment would continue their labor, often under closer supervision than local workers received, with employers watching for signs of theft, laziness, or incompetence. Those without work faced the challenge of how to spend time productively without appearing to be loitering or casing potential targets for theft. Walking around town could be seen as suspicious behavior, but sitting in one place too long could also attract unwanted attention from authorities. The late afternoon brought the daily challenge of securing accommodation for the coming night. Popular inns might fill up with regular customers or traveling merchants who had established relationships with innkeepers. Strangers often found themselves negotiating for space in less desirable accommodations, rooms that were damper, noisier, or less secure. The process required walking from inn to inn, comparing prices and availability, while carrying all your possessions, because leaving them unattended anywhere was asking for trouble. Evening meals were often the most socially isolating part of a stranger's day. Locals would gather with friends and family, sharing food and conversation, while strangers ate whatever they could afford from vendors or prepared simple meals from ingredients they'd purchased during the day. The cooking facilities available to travelers were minimal, and perhaps access to a communal fire pit where they could heat food, but always with the understanding that locals had priority for the best spots and cooking times. The process of settling in for the night involved a complex security assessment that locals never had to consider. Which corner of the sleeping room offered the best protection from theft? How could you position your belongings to detect if someone tried to take them during the night? Which of your fellow travelers seemed most trustworthy, and which ones should you watch carefully? The mental exhaustion of constant vigilance was as tiring as any physical labor. Weather added another layer of complexity to the stranger's experience. Rain meant that outdoor work became scarce, but it also meant that indoor accommodations became more expensive and harder to find. Snow could trap travelers in communities that didn't want them there for extended periods, creating tension as resources became scarce and patience wore thin. Hot weather meant that the most available work, heavy labor outdoors, became even more unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Seasonal celebrations and religious holidays created interesting opportunities and challenges for strangers. During festivals, communities might be more welcoming to outsiders who could contribute entertainment, extra labor for preparations, or simply additional participants to make celebrations more lively. But strangers had to navigate unfamiliar customs and traditions without making embarrassing mistakes that would mark them as outsiders even more clearly. The legal implications of being a stranger extended beyond criminal law into civil disputes and everyday disagreements. If a stranger had a disagreement with a local merchant about the quality of goods or services, local authorities were likely to side with the person they knew rather than the outsider making accusations. This meant strangers had to be particularly careful about any business dealings, often accepting inferior goods or services rather than risk a confrontation they were unlikely to win. Personal relationships were perhaps the most challenging aspect of long-term travel for medieval strangers. Forming friendships required overcoming the constant suspicion and social barriers that marked outsiders as different. Romantic relationships were even more complicated, as communities often viewed strangers who showed interest in local young people as potential threats to family honor and social stability. Marriage between a local person and a stranger required extensive negotiations and guarantees that the outsider wouldn't simply disappear with a dowry or abandon their spouse. The accumulation of small daily humiliations and exclusions created a psychological burden that affected how strangers moved through the world, always being the last person served, always paying slightly more for goods and services, always being excluded from casual conversations and social gatherings. These experiences shaped how travelers interacted with communities and how they viewed themselves in relation to settled populations. Information gathering was both crucial and difficult for strangers. Knowing which roads were safe, which towns offered better opportunities, which local customs were most important to observe, this knowledge could make the difference between success and failure, safety and danger. But getting reliable information required building trust with people who had little reason to help someone they'd never see again. The development of survival skills specific to being a perpetual outsider became essential for long-term travelers. Learning to read social cues quickly, adapting behavior to local expectations, finding ways to make oneself useful without appearing threatening. These skills separated successful travelers from those who found themselves constantly in trouble or unable to find the resources they needed. Medical care presented particular challenges for strangers who became ill or injured far from home. Local healers might be reluctant to treat outsiders, especially if they suspected contagious diseases or couldn't verify that they would be paid for their services. Strangers often had to rely on folk remedies, religious charity, or simply enduring illness without proper treatment until they recovered or died. The psychological adaptation required to live as a permanent stranger was significant. Some travelers became hardened and cynical, expecting the worst from every interaction and developing thick skins against constant rejection and suspicion. Others maintained optimism and charm as survival strategies, using personality and humor to break down barriers and create temporary connections with locals. Both approaches had their advantages and drawbacks in different situations and communities. Record keeping and documentation became increasingly important as administrative systems developed throughout the medieval period. Strangers who could prove their identities, trades, or legitimate purposes through written documents had significant advantages over those who relied solely on verbal claims. But obtaining such documentation required connections and resources that many travelers lacked, creating another barrier to social acceptance and economic opportunity. The economics of constant travel created unique financial challenges. Strangers couldn't build up stores of food, tools, or other resources that settled people accumulated over time. Everything had to be portable, which meant paying premium prices for compact, lightweight versions of necessary items. The inability to establish credit relationships or participate in seasonal economic cycles, like buying grain after harvest when prices were low, meant that travelers often paid higher costs for basic necessities. Communication networks among travelers developed as a way to share information about safe routes, welcoming communities, and opportunities for work. Strangers would leave messages at inns, churches, or other gathering places for others who might follow similar routes. These informal networks provided some sense of community and mutual support among people who were otherwise isolated from traditional social structures. The gradual acceptance process in communities where strangers stayed for extended periods followed predictable patterns. Initial hostility would slowly give way to wary tolerance as travelers proved they weren't immediate threats. Small acts of helpfulness during community crises, helping fight fires, assisting with difficult births, contributing skills during emergencies, could accelerate acceptance. But even after months or years, full integration remained elusive for many travelers who would always be remembered as outsiders. The impact of being a stranger extended beyond immediate practical concerns to shape fundamental aspects of identity and worldview. Constant exposure to different communities, customs, and ways of life gave travelers broader perspectives than most settled people possessed. But this cosmopolitan experience came at the cost of deep roots and stable relationships that anchored most people's sense of self and place in the world. The legacy of medieval attitudes towards strangers influenced legal systems, social customs, and economic relationships for centuries. The tension between openness to trade and travel versus protection of local interests and security created ongoing debates about how communities should balance welcoming outsiders with maintaining social cohesion and stability. How they taught writing using dust and a stick. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of the monastery school at Saint-Denis, casting long shadows across what appeared to be nothing more than wooden trays filled with fine sand. But these humble containers held the key to one of medieval Europe's most ingenious educational innovations, a system so elegant in its simplicity that it would survive for over 8 centuries, teaching countless generations to form their first letters using nothing more than dust and a pointed stick. Brother Anselm, the school's writing master, had spent the previous evening preparing the sand tables with the same meticulous care that a scribe might lavish on preparing parchment. The sand itself wasn't just any ordinary dust swept from the monastery floors. This was specially prepared pulvis scribendi, writing dust, created through a process that transformed common materials into the perfect medium for learning the sacred art of letters. The preparation began with river sand, carefully sifted through a series of increasingly fine mesh screens made from horsehair stretched across wooden frames. The coarsest particles were removed first, followed by any organic debris, tiny stones or fragments of shell that might catch a stylus or create unwanted texture. What remained was then washed repeatedly in clean water, stirred gently with wooden paddles, and allowed to settle so that any remaining impurities could be skimmed from the surface. But the really fascinating part was what happened next. The clean sand was mixed with powdered charcoal in carefully measured proportions, typically 1 part charcoal to 12 parts sand, creating a writing surface that was both smooth enough for delicate letter formation and dark enough to provide clear contrast against the pale wooden trays. The charcoal wasn't simply ground up burnt wood. It was prepared through a specific process that involved burning hazelnut shells in a controlled fire, grinding the resulting charcoal with a mortar and pestle, and sifting it through silk cloth to achieve the perfect fineness. The wooden trays themselves were masterpieces of medieval carpentry, though they appeared deceptively simple. Each tray was carved from a single piece of seasoned oak, hollowed to a depth of exactly 3 finger widths, and smoothed to a finish so fine that not a single grain of the wood's natural texture remained visible. The corners were gently rounded to prevent the accumulation of sand, and the entire interior surface was treated with a mixture of beeswax and linseed oil that had been heated, applied, and polished until it achieved a lustrous finish that would neither absorb moisture nor allow the sand to stick. The dimensions of these trays weren't arbitrary. Brother Anselm's predecessor, Brother Matthias, had spent years experimenting with different sizes before settling on what became the standard monastery measurements: 2 hands wide and 1.5 hands deep, with sides that sloped gently inward to prevent sand from spilling during use. The depth was crucial. Too shallow, and the stylus would scrape against the wood; too deep, and young students would struggle to reach the bottom corners when forming large letters. The stylus collection was equally sophisticated, though it might have appeared to casual observers as nothing more than a bundle of pointed sticks. Each stylus was carved from boxwood that had been aged for at least 5 years, shaped to specific proportions that had been refined over generations of teaching experience. The writing end was sharpened to a point fine enough to create delicate strokes, but not so sharp that it would dig too deeply into the sand. The other end was flattened into a small paddle, perfect for smoothing the sand surface when it was time to begin a new exercise. The creation of these styluses was itself a meditation on precision. Brother Anselm would select pieces of boxwood with the straightest grain, examining each potential stylus for knots, irregular growth patterns, or other imperfections that might affect its performance. The shaping was done with a series of increasingly fine knives, each cut carefully controlled to maintain the proper taper and balance. The finished styluses were then tested extensively, used to write hundreds of practice letters in sand trays to ensure that they produce consistent, controllable lines. The daily preparation ritual began before dawn, when Brother Anselm would enter the writing classroom and begin the careful process of preparing each sand tray for the day's lessons. The sand from the previous day's work was first smoothed with a wooden scraper, removing any impressions or irregularities left from student practice. Then it was stirred gently with a small rake made from bundled twigs, aerating the mixture and ensuring that the charcoal powder remained evenly distributed. The surface preparation was an art form in itself. Using a tool that resembled a miniature farmer's harrow, a flat wooden board studded with evenly spaced wooden pegs, Brother Anselm would drag the implement across each tray in overlapping passes, creating a perfectly level surface with a subtle texture that would hold stylus marks clearly while remaining easy to smooth for the next student. The final step involved using what he called his writing comb, a tool with closely spaced wooden teeth that created barely visible parallel lines across the sand surface, providing subtle guidelines for letter formation. The student hierarchy in the writing school was reflected in the quality of materials they were permitted to use. Beginning students, typically boys aged 6 or 7 who had just learned to recognize letters, worked with the coarsest sand mixture in the plainest wooden trays. As they progressed in skill and demonstrated proper care for their materials, they gradually earned access to finer sand, better crafted styluses, and trays with increasingly sophisticated features. The advanced students used what Brother Anselm called the perfectae tabellae, perfect tablets, which were works of art in their own right. These trays were made from rare wood, imported from the Holy Land, inlaid with thin strips of ivory that created permanent guidelines for letter spacing and line alignment. The sand mixture for these advanced trays contained not just charcoal, but also powdered lapis lazuli, creating a surface that was both functional and beautiful, with a subtle blue tint that was said to inspire students to achieve the highest levels of scribal excellence. The teaching methodology that had evolved around these sand tables was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Students didn't simply begin by attempting to form letters randomly. Instead, they progressed through a carefully structured curriculum that began with basic motor skills and gradually built toward the complex hand movements required for beautiful penmanship. The first lessons involved what Brother Anselm called exercitia preparatoria, preparatory exercises that had nothing to do with letters at all. Students would spend weeks learning to control their stylus through simple movements, straight lines drawn from left to right, vertical lines pulled from top to bottom, circles traced clockwise and counterclockwise, and wave patterns that developed the fluid wrist motion essential for good handwriting. These preliminary exercises were surprisingly demanding. The sand surface provided immediate feedback about pressure control. Press too hard, and the stylus would dig too deep, creating jagged, uneven lines. Too light, and the marks would be barely visible, failing to develop the muscle memory necessary for confident letter formation. Students had to learn to maintain consistent pressure while moving their hands steadily across the surface, a skill that required both physical coordination and mental concentration. The progression to actual letters followed a sequence that had been refined over centuries of teaching experience. Students began with letters that required only straight lines, I, L, T, F, before moving on to letters that combined straight lines with simple curves, P, B, the most challenging letters, those requiring complex curves and precise spacing, says, G, Q, O, were reserved for students who had demonstrated mastery of the simpler forms. But the really ingenious aspect of the sand table system was how it handled the problem of mistakes. On parchment or vellum, an error meant scraped surfaces, chemical erasures, or complete rewriting. In the sand tray, a mistake was simply smoothed away with the paddle end of the stylus, the surface restored to perfect condition in seconds. This forgiving quality encouraged experimentation and bold strokes, allowing students to develop confidence without the paralyzing fear of wasting expensive materials. The daily rhythm of sand table instruction had its own peculiar challenges. Unlike ink, which dried and remained visible for extended periods, sandwriting was ephemeral. Letters formed in the morning might be accidentally disturbed by afternoon, requiring constant supervision and immediate evaluation of student work. Brother Anselm had developed an elaborate system of assessment that relied on quick observation and detailed memory rather than permanent records. He would circulate among the students with what he called his tabeller observation, his observation tablet, a small wax tablet on which he would make quick notes about each student's progress, using a system of symbols and abbreviations that he had developed over years of teaching. A small cross indicated good letter formation. A circle marked spacing problems. A wavy line showed inconsistent pressure, and various other marks recorded the subtle details of each student's developing technique. The seasonal variations in sand table instruction reflected the practical realities of medieval life. During the warm months, when the monastery's windows could be left open, the fine sand and charcoal dust created few problems. But winter brought its own challenges. The closed, heated spaces caused the dust to become airborne more readily, creating respiratory problems for both students and teachers. Brother Anselm had experimented with various solutions, eventually settling on a mixture that included a small amount of gum arabic, which helped bind the particles and reduce the amount of dust that became airborne during writing exercises. The winter months also brought changes in the sand's texture and behavior. The dry air caused the mixture to become more prone to static, making letters appear fuzzy or causing sand particles to cling to styluses. Brother Anselm developed a routine of lightly misting the prepared sand with water that had been blessed and mixed with a tiny amount of honey, just enough to add slight moisture without creating mud. The advanced students were eventually introduced to what was called scriptura mixta, mixed writing, where they would alternate between sand table practice and actual ink work on practice vellum. This transition phase was crucial for developing the confidence to work with permanent materials. Students would first perfect a letter or word sequence in sand, then immediately reproduce it in ink, while the muscle memory was still fresh. The sand tables served as both practice space and safety net, allowing students to work out problems before committing ink to expensive writing surfaces. The monastery's approach to teaching different script styles using sand tables was particularly innovative. The same basic equipment could be adapted for various writing systems simply by changing the stylus and adjusting the sand texture. For Gothic letters, which required sharp, angular strokes, students used styluses with broader chisel-like tips and worked with coarser sand that would hold crisp edges. For the flowing curves of Carolingian minuscule, they switched to finely pointed styluses and the smoothest possible sand mixture. The mathematics of letter spacing and line alignment were taught using sand tables equipped with temporary guidelines made from thin silk threads stretched across the tray at measured intervals. Students would practice forming letters that touched these guidelines at precisely the right points, developing the spatial awareness necessary for professional quality script. The threads could be adjusted for different letter heights and line spacing, making the same tray suitable for students working on different script styles or sizes. The quality control procedures for maintaining the sand table system were remarkably thorough. Each tray was completely emptied and cleaned weekly, the wood re-oiled monthly, and the sand mixture replaced entirely at the beginning of each term. Brother Anselm maintained detailed records of which sand mixtures worked best for different types of instruction, which stylus designs lasted longest under heavy use, and which tray configurations produced the best student outcomes. The record keeping extended to tracking the progress of individual students through what he called the curriculum pulveris, the dust curriculum. Each student's advancement was documented with notes about their mastery of different letter forms, their pressure control, their spacing accuracy, and their overall readiness to progress to permanent materials. These records were surprisingly detailed, including observations about left-handed students who required special stylus grips, students with vision problems who needed larger letter forms, and students whose motor skills developed at different rates. The sand table system had evolved its own specialized vocabulary that would have been incomprehensible to outsiders, but was perfectly clear to anyone involved in medieval writing instruction. A student who pressed too hard was said to be digging graves for letters. Poor spacing was called crowding the saints. Inconsistent pressure that created letters of varying darkness was known as breathing on the words. These colourful terms served both as teaching tools and as gentle corrections that avoided the harsh criticism that might discourage young students. The social dynamics of the sand table classroom reflected the broader hierarchies of medieval society, while also creating unique opportunities for peer teaching. Advanced students were often assigned to help beginners, a practice that reinforced their own skills while providing individualized attention for struggling learners. The sand tables made this peer teaching particularly effective because both students could work on the same surface, with the advanced student guiding the beginner's hand through proper letter formation. The seasonal replacement of sand created its own rituals and opportunities for student involvement. In early autumn, the entire class would participate in preparing the new sand mixture for the coming year. Students would take turns operating the sifting screens, stirring the charcoal powder, and testing the consistency of different mixtures. This hands-on involvement helped them understand the materials they worked with and gave them a sense of ownership in their learning environment. The monastery's sand table system had to adapt to accommodate students from different linguistic backgrounds, as medieval schools often served diverse populations. Brother Anselm had developed techniques for teaching Latin letter forms to students whose native languages used different writing systems. The sand tables were particularly useful for this, because students could practice unfamiliar letter shapes without the added pressure of managing ink and parchment, while learning new motor patterns. The integration of sand table practice with religious instruction created unique pedagogical opportunities. Students would copy biblical passages in sand before attempting them in ink, allowing them to focus on the spiritual content while simultaneously developing their scribal skills. Favorite biblical verses would be practiced hundreds of times in sand, with students gradually memorizing the text while perfecting their letter formation. The evening routine of sand table maintenance became a meditative practice in itself. After the students had departed, Brother Anselm would spend quiet hours carefully smoothing each tray, checking styluses for wear, and preparing materials for the following day. The repetitive motions of surface preparation, the gentle sound of sand being leveled and textured, and the satisfaction of preparing perfect writing surfaces created a peaceful conclusion to each day's teaching. The long winter nights provided opportunities for experimenting with variations and improvements to the system. Brother Anselm would test different mixtures, try new stylus designs, and refine his teaching techniques, while the monastery settled into its quiet evening routines. Some of his most innovative solutions emerged from these solitary hours of experimentation, when he could focus entirely on the subtle interactions between sand, stylus, and human hand that made beautiful writing possible. The spring renewal of materials brought fresh energy to the writing classroom. New sand, newly carved styluses, and freshly oiled trays created optimal conditions for learning, while students who had struggled through the winter months often experienced sudden breakthroughs as they worked with perfectly prepared materials. The cycle of preparation, use, maintenance, and renewal created a rhythm that connected the practical work of teaching writing to the larger patterns of medieval life. As the seasons turned and generations of students progressed, from sand tables to parchment, and eventually to the production of illuminated manuscripts, the humble writing dust continued to serve its essential purpose. Each grain of sand that held the impression of a student's first letter, each stylus mark that taught proper pressure and spacing, each smooth surface that invited fresh attempts at perfection, contributed to the preservation and transmission of literacy in an age when books were treasures and writing was a sacred art. The quiet scraping of stylus against sand, the soft whisper of smoothing tools preparing fresh surfaces, and the gentle rustle of students adjusting their positions around the writing tables created a soundscape of learning that echoed through the monastery halls day after day, season after season, year after year. What it was like to cast lots in ancient Jerusalem. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the temple treasury, illuminating what appeared to be an ordinary collection of small objects scattered across a polished stone table. But these weren't mere trinkets or gaming pieces. They were the sacred Purim, the lots that would determine everything from priestly duties to the distribution of conquered lands, from the selection of scapegoats to the assignment of temple services. In first-century Jerusalem, the casting of lots was serious business, governed by elaborate protocols that had been refined over centuries of religious and civic practice. Rabbi Eleazar ben Azariah, the temple's chief administrator for lot casting procedures, began each day by examining the various sets of lots stored in cedar boxes lined with lamb's wool. Each set was crafted for specific purposes, made from different materials and marked with symbols that carried profound spiritual and practical significance. The most sacred lots, used for the Day of Atonement ceremonies, were carved from olive wood that had been blessed by the high priest and aged for 7 years in the temple's innermost chambers. The preparation of these lots was itself a ritualized process that required the coordination of multiple craftsmen and religious authorities. The wood selection began with temple foresters who would examine olive trees in the sacred groves near Jerusalem, looking for specimens that showed no signs of disease, insect damage, or irregular growth. The chosen trees were marked with consecrated paint and left to stand for an additional year, during which they were monitored by temple guards to ensure that nothing profane came into contact with them. The actual harvesting of the wood required the participation of priests who had undergone specific purification rituals. Using knives that had been blessed and sharpened according to ancient specifications, they would cut the selected branches during the pre-dawn hours of the new moon, when the spiritual influences were considered most favorable for creating sacred objects. The cut branches were immediately wrapped in linen cloths that had been woven by temple virgins and transported to the temple workshops in special carrying cases made from cedar and gold. The carving process was entrusted to a hereditary guild of craftsmen known as the Charashim, whose families had been producing sacred objects for the temple for over 3 centuries. These artisans worked in a special chamber beneath the temple courtyard, a space that was ritually purified weekly and maintained at specific temperature and humidity levels to ensure optimal working conditions. Each craftsman was required to undergo purification baths before beginning work and to maintain ritual purity throughout the carving process. The tools used for carving the lots were themselves objects of religious significance. The knives were made from iron that had been smelted in furnaces, blessed by the priests, shaped by smiths who had taken oaths of religious devotion, and sharpened using whetstones that had been quarried from specific locations in the Judean hills. The carving benches were made from acacia wood that had been seasoned for decades and treated with oils that had been blessed during temple ceremonies. The shapes and sizes of the lots varied according to their intended use, but all followed proportional rules that had been established by ancient tradition. The most common lots were small rectangular pieces, roughly the size of a child's thumb, with surfaces that had been polished smooth and then marked with symbols using ink made from a mixture of oak gall, iron sulfate, and wine that had been blessed by the high priest. The symbols themselves were not random decorations, but carefully chosen marks that carried specific meanings within the temple's complex symbolic system. The storage and organization of the various lot sets required its own specialized knowledge and administrative structure. Rabbi Eliezer maintained what he called the Sefer Purim, the Book of Lots, a detailed inventory that recorded the location, condition, and sacred status of every set of lots in the temple's possession. This ledger contained not just basic information but detailed histories of each set, including when they were made, which craftsmen had worked on them, what ceremonies they had been used for, and what blessings had been pronounced over them. The daily inspection routine was surprisingly complex. Each morning, Rabbi Eliezer would examine every set of lots that might be used that day, checking for signs of wear, damage, or contamination that might affect their sacred status. He would test the balance of each lot by rolling it across the polished stone table, observing how it moved and settled to ensure that it hadn't been damaged or altered. Any lot that showed irregular behavior would be immediately removed from service and subjected to intensive examination by the temple's technical experts. The actual casting procedures varied dramatically depending on the purpose and the spiritual significance of the decision being made. For routine temple duties, determining which priest would tend the altar fires, who would prepare the incense, or who would lead the daily prayers, the process was relatively straightforward. The relevant lots would be placed in a special bag made from linen that had been woven without knots, shaken according to prescribed motions and drawn by the senior priest present. But for decisions of greater spiritual importance, the procedures became extraordinarily elaborate. The selection of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement required a ceremony that involved multiple sets of lots, complex purification rituals, and the participation of dozens of priests and temple officials. The lots used for this ceremony were stored in a special chamber that was opened only once a year, handled only by priests who had undergone months of preparation, and subjected to inspections that examined every surface for signs of divine favour or disfavour. The casting surface itself was a work of art, a circular table made from a single piece of marble that had been quarried from the Temple Mount itself and polished until it achieved a finish so smooth that it seemed to glow in the flickering light of the temple's oil lamps. The table's surface was marked with concentric circles and radiating lines that served as guidelines for interpreting the lot's final positions. The patterns created by these markings were based on ancient geometric principles that were said to reflect the underlying structure of divine creation. The interpretation of lot casting results required specialized knowledge that was passed down through generations of temple scholars. The final position of each lot, its orientation, its distance from the center of the table, its relationship to the marked guidelines, all carried significance that had to be carefully analyzed and recorded. Rabbi Eliezer maintained a library of interpretation manuals that contained thousands of recorded precedents, each one describing a specific lot casting configuration and its accepted meaning. The record-keeping requirements for lot casting were extensive and detailed. Every casting was recorded in multiple ledgers, with information about the date, the participants, the purpose, the specific lots used, the exact procedures followed, and the results obtained. These records served multiple purposes. They provided precedents for future decisions, they maintained accountability for important choices, and they created a historical archive that could be consulted when questions arose about past decisions. The seasonal calendar of lot casting reflected the rhythm of temple life and the agricultural year. During the spring festivals, lots were cast to determine the assignments of priests for the increased ceremonial activities. Summer brought decisions about the distribution of harvest offerings and the selection of animals for various sacrifices. Autumn required the most complex lot casting procedures as the high holy days approached and the most sacred ceremonies of the year needed to be properly organized. The winter months were traditionally used for the maintenance and renewal of the lot casting system. Old lots that had become worn or damaged were ritually retired and replaced with newly crafted ones. The casting surfaces were cleaned and repolished, the storage containers were inspected and repaired, and the various procedural manuals were updated with the year's new precedents and interpretations. The social hierarchy of lot casting participation reflected the broader structure of temple society. Only certain priests were authorized to handle the most sacred lots, and these positions were inherited through family lines that could be traced back for centuries. The junior priests were responsible for maintaining the equipment and preparing the casting surfaces, while the senior priests conducted the actual ceremonies and interpreted the results. The training required to become a qualified lot casting official was extensive and rigorous. Candidates spent years learning the proper handling techniques, memorizing the various procedural requirements, and studying the complex interpretive traditions. They were tested on their knowledge of the different lot types, their understanding of the symbolic meanings, and their ability to conduct ceremonies without making errors that might invalidate the results. The quality control measures for lot casting were remarkably sophisticated. Each lot was regularly tested for balance and consistency, using techniques that had been developed over centuries of experience. The testing involved rolling the lots across specially designed surfaces observing their behavior in various conditions and comparing their performance to established standards. Any lot that failed these tests was immediately removed from service and either repaired or replaced. The manufacturing standards for new lots were incredibly precise. The craftsmen used measuring tools that had been calibrated against master standards maintained in the temple's archives. The weight, dimensions, and surface finish of each lot had to fall within narrow tolerances, and any piece that failed to meet these standards was rejected and the materials recycled for other temple uses. The ritual purification requirements for lot casting created their own complex procedures. The lots themselves had to be purified before each major ceremony, using water that had been blessed according to specific formulas and applied with brushes made from specially prepared animal hair. The casting surfaces were cleaned with oils that had been blessed by the high priest and polished with cloths that had been woven by temple virgins. The psychological aspects of lot casting were carefully managed through elaborate ceremonial procedures designed to ensure that the participants approached the process with appropriate reverence and spiritual preparation. The priests who conducted the ceremonies underwent specific purification rituals that included fasting, ritual bathing, and extended periods of prayer and meditation. The atmosphere in the lot casting chamber was deliberately designed to inspire awe and spiritual focus. The acoustic properties of the lot casting chamber had been carefully designed to enhance the ceremonial experience. The room's dimensions and surface materials were chosen to create subtle echoes that amplified the sounds of the ceremony without creating distracting noise. The gentle clicking of lots being shaken in their containers, the soft whisper of priestly robes moving across the polished floors, and the quiet murmur of prayers created a soundscape that was both soothing and spiritually charged. The lighting in the lot casting chamber was provided by oil lamps that burned specially prepared olive oil mixed with aromatic herbs. The lamps were arranged in patterns that created pools of warm light on the casting surfaces while leaving the surrounding areas in mysterious shadow. This lighting arrangement was designed to focus attention on the lots themselves while creating an atmosphere of sacred mystery that enhanced the spiritual significance of the proceedings. The temperature and humidity in the chamber were carefully controlled through an ingenious system of ventilation shafts and water basins. The temple's architects had designed the space to maintain optimal conditions for the lot's performance while ensuring the comfort of the participants. The air was kept slightly cool and dry, which prevented the lots from sticking to surfaces or behaving unpredictably due to moisture. The seasonal variations in lot casting procedures reflected both practical considerations and spiritual beliefs about the changing nature of divine will throughout the year. During the rainy season, additional purification rituals were required to counteract the effects of increased humidity. The summer months brought concerns about heat affecting the balance of the lots, leading to more frequent testing and calibration procedures. The documentation of lot casting results was maintained in multiple formats to ensure accuracy and prevent tampering. The primary records were written on specially prepared parchment using ink that had been blessed by the high priest. Duplicate records were maintained on clay tablets that were fired in temple kilns and stored in separate locations. The most important decisions were also recorded on metal plates that were kept in the temple's innermost treasury. The interpretation of complex lot casting results often required consultation with the temple's council of elders, a group of senior priests and scholars who had decades of experience in analyzing the subtle meanings of various lot configurations. These consultations were conducted according to formal procedures that ensured all relevant factors were considered and that the final interpretation reflected the collective wisdom of the temple's most knowledgeable authorities. The training of new lot casting officials included extensive practice with replica lots and casting surfaces, allowing candidates to develop their skills without risking contamination of the sacred objects. These practice sessions were conducted under the supervision of experienced officials who provided detailed feedback on technique, interpretation, and ceremonial procedure. The training process typically lasted several years and culminated in formal examinations that tested both theoretical knowledge and practical skills. The maintenance of the lock casting tradition required constant attention to the preservation of ancient knowledge and techniques. The temple maintained a library of scrolls that contained detailed descriptions of procedures, interpretations, and historical precedents. These texts were regularly copied by specially trained scribes to ensure that the knowledge would not be lost due to the deterioration of the original documents. The annual cycle of lock casting activities created a rhythm that connected the daily operations of the temple to the larger patterns of religious observance and agricultural activity. The spring brought decisions about planting and harvesting. The summer focused on the distribution of produce and the assignment of ceremonial duties. The autumn emphasized the preparation for the high holy days, and the winter concentrated on planning and preparation for the coming year. The evening procedures for securing the lock casting materials were as elaborate as the morning preparations. Each set of lots was carefully cleaned, inspected, and returned to its designated storage container. The casting surfaces were polished and covered with protective cloths. The chamber itself was sealed with special locks that required multiple keys held by different officials to open. The quiet hours after the day's ceremonies provided opportunities for reflection and study. The priests who had participated in the lock casting would often remain in the chamber for extended periods, contemplating the day's results and their implications for the community. The soft light of the oil lamps, the gentle echoes of whispered prayers, and the profound silence of the sacred space created an atmosphere that was both peaceful and charged with spiritual significance. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the ancient rhythms of lock casting continued to mark the passage of time and the unfolding of divine will. Each casting was both a moment of decision and a link in an unbroken chain of tradition that connected the present community to its ancestral past and its promised future. The careful preservation of procedures, the meticulous maintenance of equipment, and the faithful training of new officials ensured that this sacred practice would continue to serve as a bridge between the human and divine realms, one carefully cast lot at a time. The daily struggle of wearing layers in summer. Imagine waking up on a scorching July morning in 1453, knowing you'll spend the next 16 hours wrapped in more fabric than a modern person wears to a winter wedding. The reality of medieval summer clothing wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a carefully orchestrated dance between social necessity, practical survival, and what can only be described as collective insanity that shaped every aspect of daily life in ways that would seem utterly incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The foundation layer began with the camise or braise, a linen undergarment that served as both underwear and the first line of defense against your own perspiration. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people believed that changing this undergarment too frequently would weaken their natural bodily humours and disrupt the delicate balance of hot and cold that physicians insisted governed human health. So while you might assume they'd want fresh linen against their skin during summer heat, most people wore the same camise for weeks at a time, washing it perhaps once a month if they were particularly fastidious about their hygiene. The logic behind this practice was rooted in medieval medical theory, which held that the body needed to maintain a consistent relationship with its clothing. Physicians argued that frequent changes of undergarments could cause dangerous fluctuations in body temperature, leading to fever, chills, or even death. This belief was so strong that some medical texts specifically warned against changing linens during the hottest summer months, claiming that the shock of fresh fabric against overheated skin could cause the blood to curdle or the heart to stop entirely. Over this increasingly aromatic base layer came the cot or kirtle, a fitted garment that was essentially a medieval underdress. Even in summer, this was typically made of wool because linen was expensive and cotton hadn't yet made its way to most European markets in any significant quantity. Yes, wool in summer, thick, heat-trapping, moisture-absorbing wool that would make modern people faint just thinking about it. The reasoning was both practical and superstitious. Wool was believed to regulate body temperature naturally by creating a barrier between the skin and the external environment. And it also represented a certain level of prosperity that couldn't be abandoned just because the sun was beating down mercilessly on your wool-wrapped body. The quality of wool used for summer cotters varied dramatically based on social class, but even the finest wool presented challenges. Wealthy individuals might wear wool so finely woven it felt almost like silk, dyed in expensive colors, using techniques that required multiple treatments and could take weeks to complete. The poor made do with coarse, undyed wool that was scratchy, thick, and absorbed sweat like a sponge, creating a perpetual state of dampness that bred its own collection of unpleasant odors and skin irritations. But we're only getting started with the layers. Next came the surcoat, an outer dress or tunic that displayed your social status through its color, fabric quality, and decorative elements. The wealthy might wear silk or fine wool dyed in expensive colors like deep blues achieved with costly lapis lazuli, or rich reds created from imported cochineal beetles, colors that absorbed heat magnificently and created what was essentially a walking solar collector. The poor made do with undyed wool or rough linen, which was marginally cooler but still represented multiple layers of fabric wrapped around their bodies like a medieval straitjacket. The truly fascinating part is how medieval people developed an entire culture around managing these layers in summer heat, creating elaborate systems of survival that were passed down through generations like military secrets. Wealthy households employed specific servants whose sole job was to help with the complex process of dressing and undressing throughout the day. These weren't simple clothing changes. They were strategic military operations against the weather that required precise timing, specialized knowledge, and sometimes emergency protocols when the heat became life-threatening. Morning preparation began before dawn, often around 4 in the morning when the air was coolest, and the household could begin the day's battle against temperature. Servants would arrive with dampened linen cloths, soaked in cool water, infused with herbs like mint or lavender, used to wipe down their employers' bodies before beginning the layering process. They developed techniques for arranging fabric to create small air pockets, essentially building a primitive ventilation system into the clothing itself by manipulating folds, pleats, and the way different garments lay against each other. These servant specialists, sometimes called summer dressers, underwent specific training in heat management techniques. They learned to recognize the early signs of heat exhaustion in their employers: flushed cheeks, rapid breathing, excessive sweating, or confusion, and knew exactly how to respond. Some carried small vials of cooling oils or herb-infused waters that could be quickly applied to pulse points on the wrists, neck, and temples to provide immediate relief. Sleeves were often detachable, not primarily for fashion reasons, as many people assume, but so they could be removed during the hottest parts of the day while maintaining the appearance of full dress. The technology of detachable sleeves was surprisingly sophisticated, with hidden lacings, pins, and even early button systems that allowed for quick removal without disrupting the overall garment structure. Some wealthy individuals owned dozens of different sleeve sets in various weights and fabrics, allowing them to adjust their clothing throughout the day as temperatures changed. The wealthy carried small portable fans made of peacock feathers, painted parchment, or even thin sheets of beaten metal decorated with intricate designs. But these weren't just cooling devices, they were sophisticated communication tools with their own elaborate social language. The way a person held their fan, fluttered it, or closed it, conveyed specific social messages about their availability for conversation, their mood, their level of discomfort, or even their romantic interests. There were actually etiquette manuals that detailed proper fan usage during summer social gatherings, with specific instructions for different fan positions and movements. The fan language was so complex that misunderstanding could lead to serious social embarrassment or even diplomatic incidents. A fan held too close to the face might signal extreme distress, while rapid fluttering could indicate either urgent need for cooling or inappropriate excitement. Some fans were designed with hidden compartments containing cooling salts, perfumed oils, or even small pieces of ice wrapped in silk, luxury items that demonstrated both wealth and sophisticated understanding of heat management technology. But perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the development of summer halls in larger homes. These were specific rooms designed to be used only during the hottest months, with thick stone walls that stayed cool even in extreme heat. Minimal windows positioned to avoid direct sunlight, and strategically placed wet cloths hanging from the ceiling that created evaporative cooling as air moved through the space. Wealthy families would literally move their daily activities to these cooler spaces, conducting business meetings, meals, and social gatherings in rooms that felt like medieval air conditioning units. The construction of summer halls required specialized architectural knowledge. Builders learned to position these rooms on the north side of houses, to use specific types of stone that retained coolness, and to create ventilation systems that drew hot air up and out while pulling cooler air in from underground sources. Some summer halls included small wells or streams that ran through the floor, creating natural cooling systems that could lower the room temperature by 10 or 15 degrees compared to the outdoor air. The furnishing of summer halls was also specialized. Furniture was made from materials that stayed cool to the touch, marble, specific types of stone, or specially treated woods that didn't absorb and retain heat. Cushions and fabrics were chosen for their cooling properties, often made from linen or silk, in light colors that reflected rather than absorbed heat. Even the decorative elements were selected for their psychological cooling effects, with artwork depicting winter scenes, water features, or cool mountain landscapes. The working classes, of course, had no such luxuries. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers developed their own survival strategies that were both practical and surprisingly sophisticated, often more effective than the elaborate systems used by the wealthy. They learned to time their most strenuous work for the earliest morning hours, often beginning before sunrise, when the air was still cool and their bodies hadn't yet begun the day's battle against overheating. Agricultural workers developed intricate scheduling systems that took into account not just the daily temperature cycle, but seasonal patterns, crop requirements, and the varying heat tolerance of different types of work. Harvesting, for example, might begin at 3 in the morning and continue until the sun became too intense, usually around 10 or 11 o'clock. Workers would then retreat to whatever shade they could find and engage in quieter tasks like mending tools, planning the next day's work, or processing the morning's harvest. The midday break, or siesta, as it was sometimes called, even in northern European countries, became a crucial survival strategy. During the hottest hours, typically from noon to 3 in the afternoon, outdoor work essentially stopped. This wasn't laziness, it was a matter of life and death. Workers who tried to continue strenuous labor during peak heat hours frequently suffered heat stroke, dehydration, or worse. The siesta period was used for rest, light indoor work, or activities that could be performed in shade. Craftsmen in particular faced unique challenges that required innovative solutions. Blacksmiths, bakers, and other workers who dealt with fire or ovens in their trades developed elaborate systems for managing heat exposure that went far beyond what their wealthy employers ever had to consider. They would work in short bursts, stepping outside frequently to cool down, and many kept large ceramic vessels filled with water nearby for both drinking and emergency cooling. The blacksmith's summer routine was particularly complex. Forges had to be lit early in the morning when the ambient temperature was coolest, and work had to be completed before the combination of forge heat and summer sun became lethal. Some smiths employed young apprentices whose primary job was to fan them with large wooden paddles during the hottest parts of their work, creating artificial breezes that could make the difference between completing a job and collapsing from heat exhaustion. Bakers faced similar challenges, but with the added complexity of timing their work around community needs. Bread had to be baked daily, regardless of temperature, but the heat from ovens combined with summer temperatures could create working conditions that were literally unbearable. Many bakers developed systems of rotating work shifts, with different bakers working through the night when temperatures were cooler, or they would bake for the entire community during brief early morning hours when the work was survivable. The church played an interesting and sometimes contradictory role in summer clothing practices. Religious authorities maintained that excessive concern with physical comfort was a sign of spiritual weakness, so officially, people were expected to bear their summer suffering with patience and grace as a form of religious devotion. However, church records from the period reveal numerous debates among clergy about whether certain accommodations could be made during particularly brutal heat waves without compromising spiritual discipline. Some monasteries developed special summer rules that allowed monks to remove their heaviest outer robes during the hottest hours of prayer, while others maintained that true devotion required enduring all earthly discomforts without complaint. These theological debates about summer clothing lasted for decades, with different religious orders taking dramatically different approaches to the question of comfort versus spiritual discipline. The Franciscans, for example, generally took a more lenient approach, allowing for practical accommodations to prevent heat-related illness, while some stricter orders viewed any concession to comfort as a dangerous compromise with worldly concerns. The theological implications went deeper than simple comfort considerations. Some religious scholars argued that God had created summer heat as a test of faith, and that finding ways to stay cool was essentially cheating on a divine examination. Others countered that God had also given humans intelligence and creativity, and that using these gifts to survive harsh conditions was actually a form of worship. These debates influenced not just monastic practices, but also the advice that priests gave to their congregations about summer survival. Women faced additional layers of complexity, literally and figuratively. Their clothing systems were even more elaborate than men's, with multiple undergarments, fitted bodices that could make breathing difficult even in cool weather, and flowing outer robes that could trap heat like ovens while also presenting tripping hazards and fire risks. The social expectations for women's appearance were also more rigid, making it much more difficult for them to make practical accommodations for extreme heat. Pregnant women during summer months faced particularly dangerous situations, as their layered clothing combined with their increased body temperature and the physical stress of pregnancy could lead to heat exhaustion, dehydration, or complications that threatened both mother and child. The medical understanding of pregnancy was limited, and many of the cooling strategies available to other women were considered inappropriate or dangerous for expectant mothers. Midwives developed specific protocols for helping pregnant women manage summer heat, including recommendations for looser lacing of bodices, frequent rest periods in cool spaces, and the consumption of specific herbal drinks believed to cool the body from within. Some of these remedies were surprisingly effective. Certain herb combinations did help with hydration and cooling, while others were based on medieval medical theories that seem absurd by modern standards, but were taken very seriously at the time. The herbal cooling drinks were particularly sophisticated, often containing combinations of mint, vervain, rose hips, and other ingredients that had genuine cooling properties. Midwives passed down recipes through generations, with each practitioner adding her own modifications based on local conditions, available ingredients, and observed results. Some of these cooling drinks were so effective that they became valuable trade commodities, with successful midwives guarding their recipes as carefully as modern companies protect their trade secrets. The wealthy developed elaborate bathing rituals, specifically for summer heat management. Contrary to popular belief about medieval hygiene, medieval people did bathe, but summer bathing was particularly complex and ritualized. Bathing chambers were filled with cool water infused with herbs like mint, lavender, or rose petals, and the entire process was carefully orchestrated to maximize cooling effects while maintaining social proprieties and medical safety. The preparation for a summer bath could take hours. Servants would spend the morning gathering and preparing herbs, cooling water to the precise temperature recommended by physicians, and arranging the bathing chamber with cooling elements like damp linen hangings, bowls of scented cooling waters, and even small blocks of ice if available. The water temperature was crucial. Too cold, and medical theory warned it could cause dangerous shock to an overheated body. Too warm, and it would provide no cooling relief. The bathing process itself followed specific steps designed to maximize cooling while minimizing health risks. Bathers would enter the water gradually, allowing their bodies to adjust to the temperature change. They would remain in the water for precisely timed periods, usually no more than 20 or 30 minutes, to avoid the weakening effects that physicians believed resulted from excessive water exposure. Servants would stand by with large linen cloths to pat the bather dry without vigorous rubbing, which was believed to generate heat and counteract the cooling benefits of the bath. After bathing, a complex process of relayering began, with each garment carefully arranged to maximize whatever cooling effect could be achieved. This wasn't simply putting on clean clothes. It was a strategic process of building ventilation systems into the clothing arrangement. Servants learned to create small air pockets between layers, to arrange fabric so that it didn't cling too closely to the skin, and to position garments so that any available breeze could circulate through the clothing system. Some wealthy individuals changed their complete outfit 2 or 3 times per day during the hottest summer periods, requiring teams of servants to manage the constant washing, drying, and preparation of clean garments. The logistics of this were staggering. Imagine the amount of water, soap, fuel for heating, wash water, and labor required to maintain multiple complete outfit changes for even a single person, let alone an entire wealthy household. The laundry operations during summer months were particularly complex. Garments soaked with perspiration required special treatment to prevent permanent staining and odor. Different fabrics needed different washing techniques, and the delicate fabrics worn by the wealthy required careful handling to prevent damage. Silk, for example, couldn't be washed in the same manner as wool or linen, and some dyes would run or fade if exposed to certain washing methods. Drying clothes during humid summer weather presented its own challenges. Garments that weren't dried properly could develop mildew, which was not only unpleasant, but could also damage expensive fabrics beyond repair. Servants developed techniques for speed drying clothing using hot stones, carefully positioned fires, or special drying chambers that could reduce drying time while protecting delicate fabrics. The economic impact of summer clothing management was substantial and influenced everything from household budgets to regional economies. Wealthy households spent enormous sums on additional servants during summer months, extra linens for frequent changes, and specialized cooling equipment. The seasonal employment patterns created by summer clothing needs provided work for thousands of people, from the specialized servants who managed clothing systems to the craftspeople who created cooling implements and summer-specific garments. Some families actually maintained separate summer residences in cooler locations, essentially becoming medieval snowbirds who migrated seasonally to escape the heat. These summer homes were often located in mountainous areas, near large bodies of water, or in regions known for cooling breezes. The logistics of moving entire households seasonally were enormous, requiring advanced planning, specialized transportation, and coordination with suppliers in both locations. The summer migration patterns of wealthy families created seasonal economic booms in cooler regions. Local craftspeople, food suppliers, and service providers could earn substantial income during the summer months by catering to the wealthy refugees from hot climates. Some regions built their entire economies around providing summer retreat services, developing specialized industries focused on cooling technology, summer entertainment, and heat management services. Markets and trading schedules adapted entirely around summer clothing needs. Fabric merchants knew that certain types of lighter weight cloths would be in high demand during hot months, and they adjusted their inventory and pricing accordingly. The seasonal demand for cooling implements, lightweight fabrics, and summer-specific services created complex trading patterns that influenced international commerce. Tailors developed summer-specific techniques for creating garments that appeared to meet social standards while providing maximum possible comfort. These techniques were closely guarded trade secrets, passed down through apprenticeship systems and carefully protected from competitors. A tailor who could create clothing that looked appropriately formal while actually providing cooling relief could charge premium prices and build a wealthy clientele. The construction techniques for summer clothing were surprisingly sophisticated. Tailors learned to create hidden ventilation systems within garments, using techniques like strategic placement of gussets, hidden openings that could be closed or opened as needed, and layering systems that created air circulation while maintaining the required appearance. Some garments included removable padding or structure elements that could be taken out during hot weather and replaced when temperatures cooled. The dyeing industry created special summer color palettes, focusing on lighter shades that would absorb less heat while still maintaining the social signals that clothing colors provided. However, the most fashionable colors, deep purples, rich blues, and vibrant reds, were still worn by those who could afford to suffer for status, leading to a sort of medieval arms race between comfort and social positioning. The social pressure to wear inappropriate clothing colors during summer was intense. Certain colors were associated with specific social ranks or professional positions, and appearing in public wearing the wrong colors could have serious social or economic consequences. A merchant who wore colors appropriate for nobility could face legal penalties, while a noble who appeared in practical but lower status colors might face social ostracism or political damage. This created a class of fashion consultants who specialized in navigating the complex relationship between social requirements and summer survival. These advisors, often women with connections to both noble and merchant classes, could provide guidance on how to maintain proper appearance while making subtle accommodations for heat. Their services were expensive but essential for anyone trying to maintain social standing during the summer months. Evening routines became elaborate productions focused entirely on cooling down and preparing for another day of heat endurance. Servants would prepare cooling baths with specific herbal combinations chosen for their cooling properties and pleasant scents. Sleeping chambers were arranged with dampened linen sheets that would provide evaporative cooling, and servants would even fan their employers to sleep with large feathered fans or wooden paddles. The preparation of sleeping spaces for summer heat was an art form in itself. Beads were arranged to maximize air circulation, with special attention paid to the direction of prevailing breezes. Bedding was chosen for its cooling properties, linen rather than wool, lighter colors that reflected rather than absorbed heat, and specific weaves that allowed air to circulate through the fabric. Some wealthy individuals employed servants, whose only job was to provide nighttime cooling services. These servants would work in shifts throughout the night, providing fanning services, replacing cooling cloths, and ensuring that their employers remained as comfortable as possible during the hottest hours. The position of night cooling servant was actually considered prestigious, as it required trust, discretion, and specialized knowledge of cooling techniques. Sleep itself became a carefully managed activity. People learned to sleep in specific positions that minimized fabric contact with their skin, and some developed techniques for arranging their clothing layers so they could be partially removed during sleep without completely undressing, which would have been considered improper and potentially dangerous according to medical theories of the time. The medical theories surrounding sleep and clothing during summer were complex and often contradictory. Some physicians believed that sleeping in too few clothes during hot weather could cause dangerous chills that might prove fatal, while others argued that excessive clothing during sleep could lead to overheating and fever. The competing theories created confusion and anxiety among people trying to balance comfort, health, and social propriety. The really fascinating aspect is how these daily struggles created entire social subcultures that influenced everything from marriage customs to business practices. People who successfully managed their summer clothing challenges gained reputations as wise and resourceful, and their techniques became valuable social currency that could be traded, shared, or sold. Techniques for staying cool while maintaining proper appearance were passed down through families like treasured secrets, with each generation adding their own innovations and improvements. Successful strategies could even influence marriage prospects, as families sought to align themselves with others who had proven their ability to navigate the complex challenges of summer survival. The knowledge of summer survival techniques became a form of social capital that could determine a family's success or failure. Families with effective cooling strategies could maintain their productivity and health during summer months, giving them economic and social advantages over those who suffered more severely from the heat. This created incentives for innovation and sharing of information, but also for secrecy and competition over the best techniques. Young people learned elaborate courtship dances that took summer heat into account, with romantic encounters timed for the cooler parts of the day, and specialized courtship gifts focused on cooling aids. Fans, scented cooling cloths, or access to private shaded gardens became tokens of serious romantic intent and demonstrated both wealth and practical understanding of summer survival needs. The timing of romantic activities during summer months required careful planning and consideration. Morning courtship, when temperatures were cooler, became popular among the wealthy, while evening encounters might involve elaborate cooling arrangements to make the experience pleasant for both parties. Some couples would meet in specially prepared cool spaces, or their families might arrange for cooling services to be available during courtship visits. The gifts exchanged during summer courtship were often practical as well as romantic. A suitor might present a potential bride with a beautifully crafted fan, a selection of cooling herbs, or access to a private cooling space. These gifts demonstrated not just wealth and affection, but also practical concern for the beloved's comfort and survival during the challenging summer months. Marriage ceremonies during summer months presented their own unique challenges. The elaborate clothing required for weddings, combined with the formal nature of the ceremonies, could create dangerous conditions for the bride, groom, and guests. Some families developed special protocols for summer weddings, including shortened ceremonies, cooling services for guests, and emergency procedures in case anyone suffered heat-related distress. The medical establishment of the time developed entire treatment protocols around summer clothing-related ailments. Physicians created detailed charts correlating different fabric weights with various bodily humors, and they prescribed specific clothing adjustments as medical treatments. The theory was that the body's natural balance could be maintained through careful management of clothing systems, and that many summer illnesses were actually caused by inappropriate clothing choices. Some doctors specialized entirely in summer clothing consultation, advising wealthy clients on the optimal balance between social propriety and heat management. These consultations were incredibly detailed, taking into account not just the individual's health, but their social obligations, work requirements, and even their astrological sign. The belief that celestial bodies influenced human health meant that clothing recommendations might vary based on the position of planets and stars during different parts of the summer. Treatment plans developed by these specialists might specify exact fabric weights for different garments, precise timing for clothing changes throughout the day, and detailed instructions for managing the complex social protocols around summer clothing adjustments. The medical approach to summer clothing was so sophisticated that some physicians wrote entire treatises on the subject, complete with diagrams, charts, and case studies. The case studies recorded by medieval physicians provide fascinating insights into the real-world effects of summer clothing practices. They documented cases of heat exhaustion, dehydration, skin conditions caused by excessive sweating in heavy clothing, and even deaths attributed to inappropriate summer clothing choices. These records show that the struggle with summer layers was not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. Public bathhouses, where they existed, became crucial social infrastructure during summer months. These weren't just places to get clean, they were community cooling centers where people could temporarily escape their clothing prison and recover from heat exhaustion. The social protocols around bathhouse use during summer were incredibly complex, with specific hours designated for different social classes and elaborate etiquette rules governing behavior in these shared cooling spaces. The management of public bathhouses during summer required sophisticated logistics and planning. Water had to be kept at optimal temperatures for cooling. Facilities had to be maintained to prevent the spread of disease, and scheduling had to accommodate the dramatically increased demand during hot weather. Some bathhouses employed additional staff during summer months, specifically to manage the crowds and provide cooling services. The social mixing that occurred in bathhouses during summer heat emergencies sometimes challenged traditional class boundaries. When the heat became life-threatening, social protocols were sometimes relaxed to allow people to access cooling facilities regardless of their usual social status. These emergency situations created unique social dynamics and sometimes led to lasting changes in community relationships. The maintenance required for summer clothing was absolutely staggering and employed thousands of people in various specialized roles. Garments needed constant cleaning due to increased perspiration, but washing and drying multiple layers of heavy fabric was time-consuming and labor-intensive. Wealthy households employed teams of laundresses who worked through the night during summer months, washing, drying, and preparing fresh clothing for the next day's heat endurance. The laundry process during summer was particularly challenging because of the volume of washing required and the difficulty of drying clothes in humid conditions. Laundresses developed specialized techniques for removing perspiration stains and odors, using combinations of soaps, herbs, and other cleaning agents that were often closely guarded trade secrets. Even the storage of summer clothing required special consideration and expertise. Garments had to be arranged in ways that prevented wrinkles, while allowing air circulation to prevent mildew and odors. Some households maintained special summer wardrobes in cooler parts of their homes, with servants responsible for rotating garments to ensure proper ventilation and prevent damage from humidity. The technology of clothing storage during summer included specialized furniture designed to promote air circulation, particular arrangements of clothing that maximized ventilation, and systems for monitoring and maintaining optimal storage conditions. Some wealthy households employed servants whose only job was managing the summer wardrobe storage systems. The psychological impact of constant heat discomfort while maintaining social appearances created its own cultural phenomena that influenced everything from literature to religious practices. People developed elaborate mental strategies for enduring physical discomfort while appearing serene and composed. These techniques were sometimes passed down through families or taught by specialized tutors who helped wealthy individuals maintain their social dignity despite their private suffering. The mental techniques for coping with summer heat included meditation practices, breathing exercises, and methods for mentally dissociating from physical discomfort. Some of these techniques were borrowed from religious traditions, while others were developed specifically for managing heat-related stress. The psychological aspect of summer survival was considered just as important as the physical preparations. The literature and art of the period often reflected the struggles with summer heat, with subtle references to cooling imagery, descriptions of comfortable clothing, and idealized depictions of cool, comfortable spaces. These cultural products provided psychological relief and escapism for people suffering through the reality of summer heat in inappropriate clothing. The seasonal transition periods, late spring and early fall, became crucial times for adjusting clothing systems and required their own specialized knowledge and planning. Families held elaborate planning sessions to determine exactly when summer clothing protocols would begin and end, taking into account not just weather patterns but social calendars, religious obligations, and economic considerations. The timing of seasonal clothing transitions was critical and could have serious consequences if miscalculated. Switching to summer protocols too early could result in insufficient protection from late spring cold snaps, while delaying the transition too long could lead to dangerous overheating during early heat waves. Families often consulted weather experts, physicians, and social advisors to determine the optimal timing for seasonal clothing changes. The process of transitioning between seasonal clothing systems was enormously complex and required weeks of preparation. Garments that had been stored during the off-season needed to be inspected, cleaned, and often repaired or altered. The servants responsible for managing these transitions required specialized knowledge of fabric care, storage techniques, and the specific requirements of different family members. As autumn finally approached and the summer heat began to fade, the process of transitioning back to cooler weather clothing was almost as complex as the summer adaptations had been. Garments that had been stored during the hot months needed careful inspection and often extensive repairs or alterations. The relief of finally being able to wear appropriate clothing for the temperature was reportedly profound, creating a seasonal psychological cycle that influenced everything from work productivity to social relationships. The psychological relief experienced at the end of summer was so significant that it influenced cultural celebrations and traditions. Some communities developed specific festivals or ceremonies marking the end of summer heat and the return to comfortable clothing, while others incorporated gratitude for surviving another summer into their religious observances. The daily struggle of wearing layers in summer heat created lasting changes in medieval culture, from architectural innovations designed to provide cooling spaces to social customs that accommodated the realities of climate-inappropriate clothing requirements, to economic systems built around seasonal heat management needs. These adaptations reveal a society that was simultaneously rigid in its social expectations and remarkably creative in finding ways to survive within those constraints. The innovations developed for managing summer heat in heavy clothing influenced technological development in other areas, with cooling techniques, ventilation systems, and fabric technologies finding applications in architecture, food preservation, and manufacturing. The knowledge gained from surviving summers in multiple layers of wool contributed to advances in understanding of human physiology, air circulation, and materials science. The long-term cultural impact of these summer survival strategies extended far beyond clothing, influencing social hierarchies, economic systems, architectural design, and even religious practices. The elaborate systems developed for managing heat while maintaining social appearances created precedents for other forms of social adaptation and innovation that would influence European culture for centuries to come. The legacy of medieval summer clothing struggles can be seen in the gradual evolution of social dress codes, the development of climate-appropriate architecture, and the emergence of technologies and practices that prioritized human comfort alongside social requirements. The ingenuity and persistence required to survive summers in wool layers while maintaining social dignity demonstrated human adaptability and creativity that would inspire innovations in completely different areas of medieval life, from engineering to medicine to social organization. These adaptations created a complex web of interdependencies that influenced medieval society in ways that extended far beyond simple clothing choices, affecting everything from urban planning to international trade, from medical practice to religious theology, from family structures to economic systems. The daily struggle with summer heat in inappropriate clothing became a defining characteristic of medieval life that shaped the development of European civilization in profound and lasting ways that continued to influence cultural practices long after more practical clothing options became available.